For almost 20 years, there was one sentence that could end any conversation about switching away from Windows before it even started. Sure, Linux is great, but you can't game on it, and it didn't matter how much faster Linux ran, how much more private it was, or how much less it nagged you with ads and forced updates. Gaming was the wall nobody could climb, and that wall just came down quietly without a keynote or a press release. And most people still haven't noticed it happened, so today we're breaking down exactly how Linux dismantled the single biggest reason people stayed loyal to Windows, and why Microsoft genuinely has reason to be worried about what comes next. And to understand how big this shift actually is, you have to go back to 2018, when Valve released something called Proton. And at the time, almost nobody took it seriously. Proton was a compatibility layer, essentially a translator letting Windows games run on Linux by converting Windows commands into something Linux could understand. And the early versions were rough. Games crashed constantly, performance was inconsistent, and most people who tried it walked away unimpressed. For years, Proton felt like a promising side project rather than a serious threat. And then Valve did something that changed the entire trajectory of PC gaming. They built a handheld console called the Steam Deck, and they built it on Linux. And this wasn't a hobby project. This was a real commercial product that needed to run thousands of existing Windows games flawlessly right out of the box for regular customers who had zero interest in tinkering with settings. So suddenly, Valve had every incentive to make Proton actually work. And work well. Every bug fixed for the Steam Deck quietly made desktop Linux gaming better too, because they were solving the exact same underlying compatibility problems. And the results speak for themselves. Independent testing throughout 2026 has repeatedly shown Linux running games with frame time consistency that matches or even beats Windows, especially on constrained hardware like handhelds, where every bit of efficiency counts, and that's not a small technical footnote. That's Linux, the operating system people used to mock for being unable to run a single AWA title, now outperforming Windows in certain scenarios on the exact same silicon. One detailed benchmark comparison on the Lenovo Legion Go found that SteamOS outperformed Windows by anywhere from 11 to 45% across different games, and it held on to more of that performance while running on battery power instead of being plugged in. Read that again. A Linux-based operating system beating Windows by up to 45% on hardware Microsoft was specifically optimized for, and it helps to understand what's actually happening under the hood here. Proton is built on top of the open source Wine project, combined with translation layers called DXVK and VKD 3D Proton, which convert direct 3D graphics calls into Vulkan. Are a modern cross-vendor graphics API that works efficiently across AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA hardware alike. And instead of forcing every developer to build a separate native Linux version of their game, Proton translates Windows API calls in real time, meaning the vast majority of existing Windows titles can run on Linux with little to no extra work from the people who made them. And community-maintained builds, often called GE-Proton, fill in the gaps even faster than the official releases, frequently patching support for brand new titles within days of launch. And this entire ecosystem has matured to the point where checking compatibility before buying a game has become almost a formality rather than a genuine gamble. And how is this even possible? The answer comes down to bloat. Windows carries years of background services, telemetry processes, forced update, checks, and Copilot integrations quietly running in the background, all competing for the same limited resources a handheld device has to work with. SteamOS, by comparison, is lean. It boots straight into a controller-friendly interface, skips the desktop entirely unless you specifically want it, and doesn't waste processing power on features nobody asked for. And when you strip away everything Windows insists on running just to exist, you free up real performance. And on a battery-powered handheld running at low power limits, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. And let's talk numbers for a second, because the market share data tells its own story. According to Valve's own Steam hardware and software survey, Linux hit an all-time high of roughly 3.58% of surveyed Steam users in December 2025. And by January 2026, Windows still dominated overall, with Windows 11 sitting just under 67% and Windows 10 close behind at almost 28%, leaving Linux at a modest 3.38%. And on its own, that number might not sound impressive, but context matters here. That percentage represents millions of active players, and it has been climbing steadily for 2 consecutive years. Small percentages of a massive platform still translate to a genuinely large and growing population. And the trend line only points in one direction, and the real transformation shows up in something one Linux gamer described after spending an entire month testing different distributions specifically for gaming. Out of a personal library of around 200 games, roughly 190 of them ran on Linux, and most of them ran well. Some even ran better than they did on the same machine running Windows, and that's not a fringe experiment anymore. That's someone with a real established game library discovering that the vast majority of it just works without terminal commands, without spending a weekend troubleshooting drivers. And a huge part of that shift comes from a new wave of Linux distributions built specifically to remove the intimidation factor that used to scare people away. Distributions like Bazzite are built on an immutable foundation, meaning the core operating system is locked down and can't be accidentally broken by a bad update or mistyped command. It ships with Steam, community-maintained Proton builds, and popular game launchers, already configured before you even boot it for the first time. You can go straight into big picture mode and use the whole thing like a console, never touching a terminal window if you don't want to, and if something does go wrong, there's a rollback. Feature that lets you instantly revert to a previous working version of the system, something Windows still can't offer nearly as elegantly despite years of trying. And other distributions have carved out their own niche too, one built by the same developer. Behind GE-Proton comes preloaded with performance-focused kernel patches, targeting lower input latency, and another has become the go-to recommendation for anyone running NVIDIA graphics on a laptop. A combination that used to be one of the messiest experiences in all of Linux, now handled with drivers pre-installed and GPU switching that simply works. And the point is, you no longer need to be a systems administrator to get a smooth Linux gaming experience. You just need to pick the right distribution for your hardware. And it's worth remembering that Valve has actually tried this before and failed. Back in 2015, the company launched something called Steam Machines, an ambitious attempt to bring Linux-based gaming PCs into living rooms everywhere, and it flopped. There weren't enough games that worked properly. The hardware partners weren't fully committed, and Linux simply wasn't ready for prime time yet. That failure could have ended the story right there. Instead, Valve learned from it, went back to the drawing board, and poured years of engineering effort into fixing the actual underlying problem, which was compatibility. The Steam Deck was the redemption arc for everything Steam Machines got wrong, and now Valve is confident enough in that foundation to bring the living room concept back from the dead. And now let's talk about the moment this stopped being a story about one console and became a story about the entire handheld gaming market, because in 2025, Valve quietly released a recovery image that stripped away the hardware checks, blocking SteamOS from being installed on rival devices. That was the crack in the door. And by June 2026, Valve had blown that door wide open with SteamOS 3.8, delivering the broadest wave of third-party handheld support the platform has ever seen. Suddenly, SteamOS wasn't just running on Valve's own hardware. It was running on the Asus ROG, Ally line, the entire Lenovo Legion Go family, the Intel-powered MSI Claw, and a long list of niche handhelds from smaller manufacturers. This wasn't Valve making a console anymore. This was Valve making an operating system that openly competes with Windows on hardware Valve doesn't even manufacture. And then Lenovo did something that really should have set off alarm bells inside Microsoft's headquarters. At CES 2026, Lenovo announced a version of its flagship Legion Go 2 handheld that ships with SteamOS pre-installed straight from the factory, fully blessed and supported by Valve, a serious mainstream hardware manufacturer choosing to sell a premium device without Windows on it at all, as a first-class option, sitting right next to the Windows version on store shelves. And here's the twist that stings for Microsoft. The SteamOS version of the Legion Go 2 actually launched at a higher starting price than the Windows version. People weren't just accepting Linux as a cheaper alternative anymore. Hey, we're paying more for it because the experience itself was considered more premium, and reviewers who compared the two versions side by side called it nothing short of Linux's first decisive victory over Windows on any platform in decades of trying. The performance was measurably stronger. The interface was built specifically for the hardware instead of being a shrunken desktop crammed onto a small screen. And there was little practical reason left to stick with the more resource-hungry, background process-heavy alternative. And when even loyal Windows reviewers start describing the operating system as poorly optimized and shoehorned onto hardware without a second thought, you know the ground has genuinely shifted. And Microsoft clearly saw this coming because they scrambled to respond. In the fall of 2025, they rolled out something called the Xbox Full Screen Experience, a console-style launcher layered on top of Windows that switches off unnecessary background services specifically to improve battery life and performance on handhelds. And think about what that actually means. Microsoft built an entire feature whose sole purpose is to make Windows behave more like the lightweight, stripped-down operating system Linux already is by default. That's not innovation. That's a company publicly acknowledging that its own product has become so bloated it needs a special mode just to compete on hardware it used to dominate without even trying. And even the improved Xbox mode hasn't fully closed the gap because the core problem isn't a missing feature, it's architectural. Windows was built as a general-purpose desktop operating system first, with gaming optimizations bolted on afterward, while SteamOS was built from day one around a single purpose, running games efficiently on constrained hardware with everything else stripped away. and you can't outfeature your way past a fundamentally different design philosophy, which is exactly why reviewers keep finding that Windows handhelds need workarounds and tweaks just to approach what SteamOS already delivers by default. And to be fair, none of this means Linux has completely won the gaming war. Valorant doesn't run on Linux, neither does Fortnite, neither does Destiny 2, and these aren't technical failures on Linux's part. They're deliberate business decisions made by developers whose anti-cheat systems explicitly block the platform. And if your gaming life revolves around competitive multiplayer titles with aggressive anti-cheat enforcement, Linux still has real gaps you need to be aware of before making the jump. The good news is that resources like ProtonDB make it easy to check exactly where your personal library stands before you commit to anything. And there's real momentum behind closing even that gap. Major anti-cheat providers like Easy Anti-Cheat and Bazzite have both rolled out official support for Proton, meaning developers using those systems can enable Linux compatibility with a relatively small amount of extra configuration instead of a total rebuild, a massive shift from just a few years ago when anti-cheat vendors treated Linux support as an afterthought at best. And here's the part that should worry Microsoft most. The remaining holdouts are shrinking, not growing. Every publisher that adds official Proton support removes one more excuse for staying on Windows. And the gating factor at this point isn't really technical anymore, it's commercial willingness. And that kind of resistance tends to erode over time once enough of the market moves. And meanwhile, Valve isn't stopping at handhelds. Reports throughout 2026 confirmed that SteamOS is laying groundwork for a proper return of the Steam Machine concept, a living room gaming device meant to directly challenge traditional gaming PCs and consoles running Windows-based software, and combine that with the steadily growing Linux share on Steam's own hardware survey. And you start to see a much bigger picture. This isn't a story about one clever handheld anymore. It's a story about an entire ecosystem quietly expanding outward from portable devices into desktops, living rooms, and everywhere in between. And here's where this connects to something bigger than gaming benchmarks alone. Because the ads baked into the start menu, the forced updates that install themselves without permission, the AI features like Copilot and Recall shoved into corners nobody asked for, all of that bloat, all of those background services quietly phoning home. That's not just an annoyance anymore, it's now a measurable performance disadvantage compared to a leaner alternative that's actively getting better every single month. Every ad Microsoft adds to Windows, every forced feature nobody wanted, is quite literally costing you frames per second and battery life compared to what SteamOS delivers on the exact same hardware. And gaming used to be the one area where none of that mattered, because there was simply no real alternative, and that excuse is evaporating in real time. Because when a company ships a premium handheld running Linux at a higher price point than the Windows equivalent, and people happily pay for it anyway, that tells you the old excuse has officially expired. And it's worth zooming out here too, because the same frustrations pushing gamers toward Linux are pushing regular desktop users too. Tech forums are increasingly filled with longtime Windows users saying they're finally ready to try something different. And it's rarely about gaming specifically. It's about years of accumulated annoyance, forced Windows 10 to Windows 11 migrations, pushed people to look at their options more seriously than ever before. And once someone is already forced to reconsider what operating system they want to be running, gaming compatibility becoming a non-issue removes the last practical objection standing in the way. Apple has picked up some of that overflow too, since MacBooks get mentioned constantly as the alternative people jump to. But Linux has a distinct advantage. Apple doesn't. You don't need to buy new hardware to try it. You can install it on the machine you already own today for free and see the difference for yourself within the hour. And there's a useful way to think about what's happening here. Plenty of industries have a moment where the underdog stops being cute and starts being a genuine threat. And it rarely announces itself with a bang. It usually looks exactly like this. A niche product that everyone dismissed for years slowly fixes its weaknesses one at a time until one day the dismissive jokes stop making sense. And Linux didn't beat Windows by being flashier or by outmarketing Microsoft. It won by being genuinely better at the one thing it was built to do. And Valve had the patience to let that reputation spread organically through word of mouth, YouTube reviews, and Reddit threads instead of a billion-dollar ad campaign, which is a much harder thing to compete against than a marketing budget. And so, where does this leave the average gamer sitting on the fence right now? If your library leans heavily toward competitive multiplayer titles locked behind aggressive anti-cheat systems, Windows still has an edge worth acknowledging honestly. But if you're like the vast majority of players, spending most of your time in single-player adventures, cooperative titles, and the enormous back catalog of games most people actually play, The evidence increasingly points in one direction. Linux isn't the compromise anymore. In a growing number of real-world scenarios, it's simply the better choice, running faster, lasting longer on battery, and doing it all without the ads, bloat, and forced updates that have come to define the modern Windows experience. And the old joke about the year of Linux on the desktop finally arriving has been a punchline in tech circles for over 2 decades. And it turns out the joke wasn't wrong. It just landed somewhere nobody expected, on the handheld sitting in your pocket instead of a dedicated desktop tower under your desk. Microsoft spent years assuming gaming would always be the one place Windows was untouchable, and that assumption just quietly stopped being true. And the company's own scramble to bolt Xbox-style optimizations onto Windows is proof they know it too. The last real excuse to stay is running out of road, and it's happening faster than almost anyone in the industry predicted. And there's strange irony sitting at the center of this whole story. Microsoft spent years treating gaming as an afterthought, bolted onto a desktop operating system built for offices and enterprise software, while quietly assuming loyalty from gamers was guaranteed no matter what else the company did to frustrate its users. Meanwhile, the company that mostly sells digital game storefronts decided to actually build an operating system around what gamers wanted and kept refining it with almost no fanfare, patch after patch. For the better part of a decade, nobody handed Valve this win. They earned it the slow, unglamorous way by fixing thousands of small compatibility issues one at a time, until the big picture quietly changed underneath everyone's feet. And that's the kind of shift that's easy to miss in real time and completely obvious in hindsight.